Would you still go on safari if you knew that it was built on land theft, blood sport, and colonial conquest, and that every single part of your dream safari experience, from the obsession with the big five, the khaki outfits, the luxury tents, to the sunset gin and tonics, has its roots in European colonialism? I recently took my family on a safari and it was an incredible experience, but it also opened my eyes and left me with so many questions. My jaw literally dropped when I learned that the big fives aren't just animals, but they were the ultimate trophies for colonial hunters who considered them as the 5 toughest animals to shoot and kill, which are now repurposed as a checklist for tourist photos. Or let's take the classic safari tent. It's modeled after the camps of colonial era hunters like Hemingway. And even the fancy sunset drink, the Sundowner, wasn't just for fun. It was literally a tool of empire, as British colonizers used the quinine in tonic water to prevent malaria while expanding deeper into African territories. I came to understand that safaris as we know them today were built on the glorification of colonial conquest. But here's what they don't tell you. This industry is still dominated by foreign ownership, and many African communities are left out of the profits from their own land. How did safaris become what they are today? Why do Africans remain largely excluded from the profits of wildlife tourism? And how can we experience safaris in a way that actually empowers local communities? That's what we are diving into today. If you love Africa and love to travel, this is something you need to hear. My name is Weni. If you're new to this channel, welcome, karibu, and salam salam. On this channel, Plan Back to Africa, I share my journey of leaving behind Germany to settle in Nairobi, Kenya. And I also share my experience of traveling the African continent together with my 2 children. And I also share my opinions and knowledge about the socio-political realities on the ground. Now, without any delay, let's dive straight into today's topic. When you think safari, you probably imagine open jeeps, khaki outfits, and taking photos of the big 5 animals. But the origin of the safari is far from innocent. The modern safari grew directly out of European colonial hunting expeditions in Africa. In fact, the very word safari comes from the Swahili word for journey, which was adapted by Europeans in the 19th century as they ventured deeper into East Africa. And these were not mere sightseeing trips. They were trophy hunting missions for European aristocrats, explorers, and adventurers showing off their conquests. Back in the late 19th century and early 20th century, Africa was being carved up by European colonial powers. Along with missionaries and explorers came wealthy hunters looking for big game. Imagine famous hunters like former US President Theodore Roosevelt came and killed hundreds of animals in one single trip. In 1909, Roosevelt's safari resulted in 512 animals killed, including many for museum specimens. Hunting big game was seen as a status symbol. Europeans competed to shoot the largest elephants for ivory or the most lions for skins. There is a quote from a Maasai elder recalling how, to the colonizers, the excitement was not in watching or photographing wildlife. Their pleasure was only fulfilled at sites such as the heaviest ivory from a big elephant, and the main attraction of the Serengeti to Europeans up until the 1930s was shooting lions. Safari was essentially a blood sport for the colonial elite. This hunting obsession wreaked havoc on African wildlife and transformed African land use. In response to overhunting, colonial authorities created game reserves and game laws, but not to protect animals for their own sake. It was to ensure there were enough animals left for future sports. And what is very important to understand is that these game reserves were often established by kicking African local communities off their ancestral land. For example, German colonizers in East Africa, in former Tanganyika, what is known today as Tanzania, outlawed traditional hunting and set aside vast lands as their own exclusive hunting grounds. Local communities like the Maasai people, who had lived off these lands for centuries, suddenly were blocked. They could no longer hunt freely for food and had only severely limited access to the new reserves. As one scholar perfectly put it, wildlife went from being a communal resource to being mostly for European use and profit. When the British took over Tanzania after World War I, they kept those exclusionary laws in place. Early national parks and reserves in Africa were a product of this colonial mindset. The oldest national park on the continent, Virunga, established in 1925 in Congo, was created by the Belgian colonial regime. Others soon followed in the 1920s to the 1950s. The pattern was always the same: clear out the people, set up borders, and declare it as wildlife sanctuary, mainly for the enjoyment of colonial officials and foreign tourists. Indigenous Africans who had managed these ecosystems for centuries were now seen as a threat to nature or simply an obstacle to recreation. Many indigenous communities, including the Maasai people, were forcibly relocated to create tourist areas. And this was often done without compensation or consent. I have spoken to one Maasai elder, and I can't wait to share this eye-opening interview where I learned so much about the struggle and the forced dispossession of ancestral land that the Maasai people face today with you in the coming weeks. For now, it's important for you to understand that the safari industry was built on African labor and dispossession from day one. Colonial powers took African lands for parks and then employed some Africans in low-paid jobs to serve wealthy foreign tourists in those same lands. The profits, of course, flowed into European operators and colonial governments, making safari tourism a leading economic sector of the East African colonial economy. Even some of the most harmless-looking safari traditions today still have traces of this colonial history. Those canvas safari tents and khaki outfits, for instance, they are modeled after what Hemingway and other big game hunters used, a romanticized out-of-Africa aesthetic straight from the colonial era. Same goes for the term the Big Five, as I have mentioned earlier: the elephant, the lion, the buffalo, the leopard, and the rhino. It used to be a hunter's term for the 5 toughest animals to shoot and kill, now being repurposed as a checklist for tourist photos. Even the evening gin and tonic sundowner ritual on safari has colonial roots. British colonizers and hunters drank gin and tonic because of the quinine inside the tonic water that helped them to prevent malaria as they pushed further into African territories. In other words, modern safari culture consciously mirrors colonial nostalgia, and it glorifies an era when Europeans dominated African lands and wildlife. And realizing all of this was kind of disturbing to me. I stood there in the safari camp with my family, enjoying the sunset over the savannah, and I thought, this beautiful experience was made possible by a history of exploitation and violence. My own ancestors might have been denied entry to these lands or forced to work as porters just so someone could claim a trophy or a photo. It was a harsh reminder and a painful reckoning for me that what we see as a fun vacation has a colonial legacy that's still with us. After learning about the colonial roots of safari, another question hit me. What about conservation? A big selling point of safaris today is that they support wildlife conservation. You will hear that without the tourist dollars, poachers will wipe out the rhinos and the elephants, and that local communities need to be educated on how to protect their wildlife. And this makes me wonder, why do so many people assume that Africans don't know how to protect and conserve their own environments? This assumption that Africans must be taught how to care for nature is deeply rooted in colonial attitudes. You know, during the colonial era, European powers justified taking land for parks by portraying African indigenous communities as ignorant and as destructive toward wildlife. They truly believed and claimed that only Western science and management could properly conserve Africa's spectacular animals. Sadly, this patronizing attitude continues well into the post-colonial era and even today. There's this underlying racist narrative that Africa's wilderness would vanish if not for Western intervention, be it through foreign NGOs, white-led park authorities, or international donors. The idea that African nature is too valuable to be managed by Africans. However, the truth is, before the arrival of the colonizers, local indigenous communities across the African continent have valued and conserved nature for centuries, just in ways that might not fit the Western mold. Many African cultures lived with wildlife in a sustainable balance. Pastoralist groups like the Maasais, for instance, avoided overhunting wild game. The Maasais, traditionally don't eat wild animals, and they only occasionally hunted lions under specific cultural rites. However, colonial authorities largely ignored indigenous knowledge and imposed their own ideas of conservation, which often meant removing people from the equation entirely. And this exclusion continues today. Many African national parks are run by Western NGOs and governments, reinforcing the false idea that only American and European expertise can protect the wild African environment. Today, many well-meaning safari programs still carry that paternalistic attitude. You will hear phrases like, we must educate locals how to value and protect their wildlife, or we must teach the locals not to poach. Certainly, education and outreach are important, but it's often framed as if love for the environment is something foreign that must be introduced rather than something that is already part of African heritage. Unfortunately, this colonial mindset continues to shape the reality in many parts of Africa. Local communities still often find themselves marginalized in decision-making about their own lands, which are managed by distant governments or international NGOs. One shocking statistic highlights the gap. Across Africa, local Black Africans have very little ownership in the safari and wildlife tourism industry itself. Imagine, only 15% of tour operators and lodge owners in the safari industry are Black Africans. The vast majority are white, either foreigners or white Africans, or let's say the descendants of these colonizers and settlers. I mean, if conservation and safari tourism are meant to benefit Africans, why are Africans so underrepresented among the owners and stakeholders? Honestly, to me personally, it feels like an extension of the colonial belief that Africans can be guides or workers, but not the ones in charge. And this needs to change. So how do we decolonize safaris? And how can we ensure that tourism actually benefits local communities rather than repeating colonial patterns? Here's what needs to change. Number one, support African-owned safari companies, fam. Unfortunately, too many safari lodges and tour operators are foreign-owned. By choosing African-owned tour companies and lodges, we make sure that more money stays within the local communities. Companies like Sarafika Tours and Pamoja Serengeti luxury camps in Tanzania, for instance, are African-owned companies that invest directly in local economies. I can highly recommend them. These are the tour operators and lodges that we booked during our last safari together with my mother and my two children. I will create more content about our experience. It was amazing, highly professional, well organized. I will put the link to their websites in the description below. Please show them some love on social media. They have an Instagram account, and consider booking them. Really, you will not regret it. Secondly, promote community-led conservation. Instead of the so-called fortress conservation that excludes the local people, we should support community-led conservancies, where people have real stakes in protecting the wildlife. Many Kenyan and Tanzanian Maasai conservancies, for instance, allow locals to benefit and to profit from tourism without losing their land. Number three, very important, reframe the narrative. The world needs to hear more from African conservationists and indigenous voices, not just foreign and Western funded NGOs. Conservation isn't about saving Africa from Africans. It's about giving African people the power to protect their own land. Number four, equally important, challenge racist attitudes in conservation. Too often, global conversations about African wildlife paint locals as poachers and foreigners as saviors. In reality, it is Africans who have done the most to protect wildlife, yet they don't receive any credit, and this needs to change. You know, going on safari in Africa shouldn't just be about watching wildlife. It should be about uplifting the communities who have lived with that wildlife for centuries. The old colonial model of safari tourism must end. If you plan to visit Africa and go on a safari, please choose an African-owned tour operator and African-owned safari lodges. Ask where your money is going and push for conservation that includes local indigenous communities and not just animals. And most importantly, share this message with your friends because change starts with awareness. Thanks so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below, and I look forward to see you next time. Bye.